Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. We had to skip round 5 of the Berlin 1890 tournament because Lasker's win over Jacques Mises was not recorded, so we're having to move on to round number 6 where Lasker plays against another member of the Berlin chess masters, Theodor von Scheve. Von Scheve seems to have earned his master title in 1884 with a shared first place at the third Southwestern German Chess Federation Congress. Here he is coming in shared first with 9.5 points alongside Mr. Solomon Löwenthal. Now, this is admittedly only a guess. The ways by which German masters earn their titles is somewhat nebulous outside of the German Chess Association's Hauptturniers, but I think this is a fairly safe assertion given that von Scheve's next appearance wouldn't be until the 1887 Frankfurt tournament. He only scored 8 points out of 20, but you can't expect somebody to perform well at their first ever international tournament, especially one of this size. But as far as tournaments within Germany are concerned, von Scheve is a very strong competitor. Here he is later in the year in 1887, finishing second at a tournament hosted by the Berlin Chess Club, 1 point behind Max Harmonis, but ahead of fellow competitors Horatio Caro and Emanuel Lasker's older brother Berthold. At the Leipzig tournament of 1888, he came fourth and again was only behind players who were also in this tournament, Kurt von Bartheleb and Jacques Mises, and as of round 1, Fritz Riemann. And most recently, at the so-called 1889 Berlin Championship, von Scheve finished first, a clear point ahead of Caro, Emil Schallop, and another player, Bernard Hulsen. Now, just like Caro back in round 2, von Scheve has a little bit of a personal vendetta to act on, as he lost in the previous round to Berthold. So there's a little bit of a score to settle between these two, at least as far as the family is concerned, and we're going to resolve that tension right now. Lasker opened this game with e4, and after e5, knight f3, knight c6, he gave us our first look at the Scotch opening with d4. E captures d4, knight captures d4, bishop to c5, bishop to e3, queen to f6, c3, and knight g to e7 was the book position at the time. White's most popular move here is bishop to c4, while in the previous decade or so, queen to d2 had also been somewhat popularized, notably by fellow German master Louis Poulsen. Now, rather than follow any of the book lines, Lasker, of course, deviated with some weird knight retreat. Knight to c2 is officially known as the Meitner variation, though I have to admit this feels like something of a slight against Mr. Philipp Meitner, the Austrian master, because he played this move exactly once and he lost the game with it. After d6, knight to d2 castles, Meitner played queen to h5 and went on to castle queenside against none other than the first world championship challenger Johann Zukertort at the Vienna tournament of 1882, and Zukertort won this game on move 25. Rather than playing d6 or, for example, exchanging on e3, von Scheve decided to retreat his bishop back to b6, and after knight to d2 castles, bishop to e2, d5, and castles from Lasker, the chess.com database has a 2012 game where black played the move bishop to e6, but if the ratings are to be believed, this was played between a 1600 and a 2400, so perhaps it's not worth discussing. Regardless, von Scheve's decision to trade here on e4 is a novelty, so it is as of move 10 that the players are playing a unique game. Before recapturing, Lasker threw in an exchange on b6, bishop b6, a b6, knight captures on e4. The queen steps out of the way to g6, which kicked the knight over to g3, and after rook to d8 and queen to c1, the bishop now came to e6. So both sides have fully developed their minor pieces. Without any pawn tension in the center, it's hard to really consider there being any serious issues. One would probably have to give the slight edge to black, as he has a little bit of an initiative, and Lasker has to worry about how he's going to deal with this a2 pawn being attacked. You probably don't want to protect the pawn with something like a3 because the light squares are terminally weakened and you're inviting at some point like a knight a5 to b3 situation. Knight to a3 is where my mind goes first. You protect the a pawn from the rook and you further free up the queen from babysitting duty here on c1. But Lasker, as per usual, tries to mix things up tactically and thrusts forward with f4 instead. Now, I don't intuitively know if it's better to take on a2 with the rook or the bishop. Just for the sake of simplicity, let's look at rook captures on a2 and get a pair of rooks off the board. Rook a2, bishop to a2. The point here is that white is looking to play the move f5, and black wants to respond to this with queen to f6. They begin to consolidate by putting the queen on e5, so white has to prevent this with a knight to e3. The point being that if the queen goes to e5, then white plays knight to g4 with tempo. This kicks the queen, the f6 square is protected, white's going to play f6, and this attack is very scary. So black should instead protect the square with queen to g5, and if now f6, then black is just in time to defend everything with knight to d5. This knight is attacked twice, and defending it is a little bit cumbersome, so white's best option is really just to trade. Knight d5, queen c1, rook c1, bishop captures on d5, And now there's nothing better for white than to simply trade on g7. F captures g7, king captures g7. Yes, black is technically up a pawn, but it's a doubled pawn here on the b file. The kingside pawns are split, so I think that even with the material difference, this is just equal. Now, it's worth noting that this is move 15, so perhaps von Scheve didn't want to spend too much time calculating whether or not he can take this a pawn before he gets to the time control, so he instead decided to keep things simple with knight to f5. After knight f5, bishop to f5, this knight is now attacked twice, so it finally moves to a3. Von Scheve moved his bishop down to e4, threatening checkmate on g2, which Lasker blocked with bishop to f3, and now von Scheve made a very controversial move in bishop to d3. The German chess magazine correctly prefers trading on f3, bishop captures f3, rook captures f3, and rook to a4, though their analysis is a little bit off. They start with the most direct way of cutting off the rook from the view of the f-pawn by playing the move b4, but after rook d to a8, they go off on a little bit of a tangent. They kind of miss that it seems like white can simply liquidate down with knight to b5, the point being that after rook a2, rook a2, rook a2, white retreats with rook to f2. And if you trade here or not, rook f2, king f2, regardless of what happens, I believe that white will be able to get away with simply taking here on c7 with equal material. The Germans try to get a little bit too tricky with it. They play rook to e3. So now if black takes on a3, then they get back rank mated. However, this is blocked with simply h6. And their real transgression is to play rook to g3. This hits the queen, but it's get kicked down to f5. It defends the b5 square, and now black is simply going to win the a pawn for nothing. So this would be horrible for white. The other line they analyze is just pushing f5, but this weakens the pawn and it becomes very easy to take over. Their line goes queen to f6, rook to f4, kicking the rook over to a5, and after queen to f1, they just give the very straightforward rook d to d5. It's not particularly flashy, but it gets the job done. White is going to lose the f-pawn. They're certainly not going to defend it with something like g4, opening up the king with the queen still on the board. So again, white's going to go down a pawn, and they will be, in some degrees, worse. But instead of that, von Scheve played bishop to d3, hitting the rook. It moved over to e1 and now h5. Queen to e3 and h4 allows us to hit the time control, and I guess all things considered, this is pretty much equal. I don't immediately know exactly what von Scheve is hoping to accomplish with this f-pawn thrust, or this h-pawn thrust, excuse me, because he's not actually able to open up the king side, as we'll see in a moment. On the other hand, this bishop on d3 looks somewhat vulnerable, but for the time being, it's protected adequately, so there really isn't anything to worry about on this front. So overall, I believe that the correct evaluation of this is pretty much equal. After Lasker's move of rook a to d1, the question pops up, what is von Scheve supposed to do from here? I've seen b5 suggested on internet forums as a very good move for black, and if black is able to get their pawn to b4 and they're able to break open white's queenside structure, then yeah, I think black gets very good play. Von Scheve decided instead to push his pawn all the way down to h3. Now, the reporting of the time considers this a huge mistake. It's not super bad on its own, but we do very quickly realize why von Scheve can't actually break open the king side with it. The issue lies in the relatively straightforward tactic of bishop captures on c6. After b captures on c6, then white does simply win the pawn on h3, queen captures on h3, and black is just down a pawn for nothing. They do technically have some compensation because these queenside pawns remain very mobile, and now von Scheve plays the move b5. After Lasker slid his queen over to f3, had von Scheve responded with the move rook to d5, he would pretty much have full compensation for the pawn. He's ready to move this bishop, and if there's a trade here on d5, he fixes the pawn structure, he's gaining a whole bunch of central space, and I would say that the black position isn't too shabby. However, after the move von Scheve actually played c5, now black's position is completely lost and Lasker has a winning tactic. So, as per usual, what I want you to do, pause the video, see if you can find the move that Lasker has at his disposal to more or less win the game on the spot. All right, 3, 2, 1. For those of you that found the move rook captures on d3, then congratulations, you have played the same move as Emanuel Lasker, and for once you've actually won the game. This rook is not allowed to take on d3 because, of course, the other rook on a8 is hanging. And if queen captures on d3 as von Scheve played, then Lasker wins with rook to e8. The point being that if the king moves down to h7, then queen to h5 mates on the spot. While if the rook takes, then of course the queen on d3 is hanging, queen will take, and white is up a whole bunch of material. So that explains why it was here after Lasker's move 26 that Theodor von Scheve resigned the game. So with that, Lasker has won his third consecutive game, and with that, his hopes of catching his older brother and overall winning the Berlin 1890 tournament are kept alive. There are still a couple of rounds left to cover, and there is a disproportionate amount of drama left to go over, so there's much more that I would like you to stay attuned to. There's much more chess coming. I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.